I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, A-M-Y, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
Welcome to the Goddard Report. Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Jordan Bateman, Director of the BC branch of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Welcome to the show, Jordan.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for having me.
We've been doing a series of stories about the deterioration of Granville Mall in the heart of Vancouver. And it's shocking that a city with the highest real estate prices in the country and some of the very highest prices in the world doesn't have a solution, I guess, to the homeless people that come here. And Granville Mall now has become a central point for several of them. Would throwing tax money at this problem make any difference?
Well, the evidence says no. I mean, we've seen, obviously, Gregor Robertson came to power with a promise to end street homelessness by 2015. The 2016 homelessness count was just done, and it's the highest in years. So, you know, all of the money that Gregor Robertson has thrown at this problem really has not done much. And there's kind of a sad story that no one really wants to talk about, and that's the poverty industry that's kind of cropped up in Vancouver, and big organizations who, executive directors who rely on, you know, hundreds of thousands, millions of tax dollars. I mean, the downtown east side is a place that has, you know, more social services, more money going into it than virtually anywhere else in British Columbia from government, and yet we still have these problems. So the evidence says money alone isn't going to solve it.
Well, I think one of the problems, you have several organizations where the executive directors are paid well over $100,000 a year. Their assistants, of course, are into six figures. And then their assistants, $80,000, $90,000 a year. By the time the actual dollar gets down to the street, what's an extra $5 to a person living on $700 a month?
That's a great point. I mean, you know, the Taxpayers Federation here, we often talk about how we'd love to be, you know, out of a job. That government started to act responsibly, and you wouldn't need a Taxpayers Federation to be in place. I'm not sure I ever hear the same kind of sentiments from people in that poverty industry, right? Like, these executive directors should be dreaming of the day that they're out of work because, you know, the tide is turned. Instead, it just seems like bigger infrastructure, bigger beasts to feed bureaucratically, and that's going to cost more taxpayers' money. You know, you think back to the Portland Hotel Society scandal, which may or may not have just been the tip of the iceberg in a lot of these organizations that were happening there, but, you know, executive directors getting limo rides and fancy hotels and Disneyland trips. You know, that sort of thing really shocked a lot of people. Unfortunately, well, it forced some change at Portland Hotel. I'm not sure it's forced change across the entire industry.
Although that seems to happen in government all over, where why take economy when first class exists, and then why not use a government jet that costs $5,000 an hour or something ridiculous like that?
Yeah, it's so easy to spend someone else's money, and that's the big problem is, you know, we hand our checkbook over to the politicians and we trust them to be doing the right thing. Sometimes they do, but often they don't.
What's the problem of homelessness beyond the scope of the city of Vancouver and the Mayor Robertson?
Well, you know, in Langley, there are people living on the street. In Maple Ridge, there was a tent city there, as well as in Abbotsford. Burnaby seems to be relatively unscathed by it, although some would argue that's because Derek Corrigan hasn't put in any of the services necessary. You know, the real interesting thing to me is you have Derek Corrigan and Gregor Robertson, both of them left-wing politicians, you know, both of them NDP voters, but two completely different views on how municipalities should handle the problem of homelessness. You have Corrigan, who says this is a provincial government responsibility. We're going to stick to our knitting and not worry about it. So he doesn't fund things like homelessness shelters or doesn't provide land to the government to build, you know, affordable housing or social housing. Whereas Robertson's gone the other route. You know, there's not a dollar he wouldn't spend on this. Well, I guess the dollars that go to bike lanes are the only thing that would transcend his love of spending money on this. And yet, Burnaby has much lower homelessness count than Vancouver. So really interesting to see that dichotomy between two politicians who generally are so alike philosophically.
Well, yes, the city of Burnaby's surplus has bounced between $600 million and $1 billion. If the city needs money, it borrows from itself, and it annually wins awards for having the lowest tax hikes for its property owners.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, Burnaby has salted away a lot of money, and to Burnaby's credit, look, I disagree with Corrigan on various issues, but to his credit, they have really embraced the gift of these transit lines, these SkyTrain lines, and aggressively put in density around them, which is the right way to go. I mean, if you're going to have lots of people living somewhere, have them on a SkyTrain line so they can move around without having to add too many vehicles. That all makes sense. And he's salted away a lot of that money, whereas Robertson has that money being spent on things like bike lanes, like public art projects, things that sort of fit his ideological agenda. So Corrigan, I guess, a bit more of a saver, Robertson a bit more of a spender, although, like I said, very odd since they're both left-wing NDP politicians.
Well, I can point out a couple of obvious differences as well. In Vancouver, you have street lights in the alleys that are paved. In Burnaby, we have streets where I live that don't have any street lights. We wanted some speed bumps to control the street racers. We had to pay for them ourselves. $650 was added to my tax bill, and I thought there's, 45 units in my condo. Did they build those speed bumps out of gold? Is my question. We have areas here where we don't have sidewalks. They still have drainage ditches. In other words, if you want improvements in your neighborhood, you pay for them yourself. They don't expect every taxpayer in the city to pay for it.
Yeah, and that's becoming more common across the region. I mean, in Langley, where I was a councillor, we had places that didn't have sewage. They used septic tanks, because they were built in the 50s and 60s before Metro Sewer came to Langley. And, for those areas to connect, that weren't part of the sewage plan, those folks had to put a 20-year tax on their bill in order to do it. And now the, township helped them by, giving them interest-free loans and things like that. But, that has become more and more of the case. Sort of that user pay philosophy where, the people who benefit most should be paying for those services. It's interesting though that doesn't extend to things like transit where, whether you live, 5 miles from a SkyTrain station or right next door, you pay the same for that TransLink service.
So looking at the issue of homelessness and, I call it grunginess, do different philosophies and the spending of money on it make a difference?
Well, Granville Mall is, the interesting point you made is land is so expensive in Vancouver. Like how have we not leveraged something on Granville Mall to make it more appealing to kind of everyday people to use? I'm not sure what's happened there, to be honest. I'm not sure if it doesn't have a strong enough lobby group or if it's just one of those things that gets swept under the rug. I mean, you think of all the councils that Vancouver's had in the past 40 years that Vision would be the most pedestrian friendly. But that doesn't seem to have taken root there. So lots of questions there, and I guess it all comes down to priorities, right? There's only so many things the city can do at once. Vision certainly has their eye on things like taking down viaducts and building bike lanes all over the place, and dealing with at least trying to look like they're dealing with the homelessness issue. So maybe they just don't have enough attention span to do the other nuts and bolts stuff.
Well, I've heard the estimate it would cost $250 million to bring down the viaducts. If you're not going to use them for cars, why not turn them into parks? Because other cities have done that with abandoned mass transit projects.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I walked along the High Line in New York City, which often gets touted as one of the world's great linear parks, and certainly has inspired some of the work that's going to go on at Arbutus, the Arbutus corridor. The viaducts is such a weird one for me because it seems really obvious to me that this is about maximizing the land beneath it, right? You have the provincial government owns some of it through PAVCO, you have the city owns some of it, and then you have private developers who own other parts of it. It seems to me it's just really an excuse to put up more buildings. I just don't, as a guy from Langley who has to go in downtown from time to time, I just find it amazing that Gregor Robertson keeps making it harder and harder for people from the rest of the Lower Mainland to access downtown. It would seem to me he'd want to make it as easy as possible so you get customers down there, get them shopping at the stores along Granville, get those empty storefronts filled. Instead, they just keep making it tougher and tougher.
Yes, Vancouver's been very successful in banning the car from downtown. 28,000 fewer car trips a day, so that's very successful. But if you have a business downtown, where do people park? Well, it's now a bike lane. I don't think they feel all that happy that cars have essentially been banned from downtown Vancouver.
Yeah, it's harder and harder to access it, and that ends up costing people money. The harder it is to get somewhere, the fewer people will go there, and that in the end will be the long legacy of the Vision Council long after they're gone. People will talk about how they chase people out of downtown, other than the folks who are rich enough to live there.
We'll have more with Jordan Bateman right after the break.
I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, AMY, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
In Goddard we trust.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Jordan Bateman. Jordan, the Fraser Institute said June 7th was Tax Freedom Day in Canada. In the U.S., it was near the end of April. A big gap there. Essentially, I guess the difference between Canada and the U.S. is that the government pays for medical care, and there the government walks away from it unless you're 65 or older. Is there more to it, though, than just Medicare?
Oh, for sure. Look, the U.S. government spends trillions on defense, national defense, and of course we spend nowhere near per capita what they're spending. So, you can make the case that, their military is their healthcare system, right? And if you're going to compare the two, they almost cancel out. So, the big problem for Canada is that governments have gotten fat and happy on taxpayer dollars. Virtually everything we buy here that is more expensive than what you could get it for in the States, the difference is because of taxes and duties and tariffs. Even gasoline, you can account for the exchange rate. Gasoline is only about 3 or 4 cents a liter cheaper in the States once you take out taxes and the exchange. So all of these things have to do with our growing tax burden. And that's why, these papers by groups like the Fraser Institute to try to calculate Tax Freedom Day are so important, because it shows that 43% of our income now disappears in taxes.
Yes, it's amazing how much money disappears, and there's so many different layers of taxation. And what can you consider taxation? For example, in BC, we pay Medicare premiums not based on your income, but just based on the fact that you're alive. So Jimmy Pattison, a billionaire, pays the same for his health care as a person living on minimum wage.
Yeah, we fought this MSP tax for quite a long time. The last couple of years, really trying to bring into focus how inefficient it is. MSP, the government likes to paint it as kind of like an insurance premium. They'll call it a premium, in fact, they don't call it a tax. The problem with that theory, though, is if it was an insurance premium, people who were super healthy would pay less than people who, never left the couch or had health issues. You would take into account, physical activity, the kind of job you work, all those different things. Of course, government doesn't do that. The reason it doesn't is because, people would kick and scream about how unfair it was. So it's not an insurance premium, and certainly does nothing to, the other myth you hear from Mike DeYoung, the finance minister, is that it's important people realize that healthcare isn't free. And yet I've seen no polling ever done that shows that more people in British Columbia understand that healthcare has a cost than people in Saskatchewan or Ontario or Quebec or places where they don't have this MSP tax. So, if you really wanted to show people what healthcare costs, send them an update every quarter or every 6 months showing all of the doctor's charges and fees from when they went to the hospital or when they went to visit their GP. That would do a whole lot more, I think, to get people to understand that healthcare is a cost rather than rather than this kind of extra tax. So yeah, I just never have bought into this idea that MSP is an insurance premium or does much to educate people on the idea that healthcare costs money. We're not stupid. We know that.
Also, government's really, I mean, the average person looks at the government as some kind of entity onto its own, and governments look at the citizens as entities onto their own. Now, here's one of my pet peeves is how come we don't have a national prescription drug care plan where the country or your province buys all the prescription drugs and all you pay is a dispensing fee like in Saskatchewan, which means the average person has more money in their pocket, and because it's a mass buying scheme for the government, everybody wins.
Yeah, I'd be a little reluctant on a national pharmacare simply because the federal government does not have a good record of running national programs cheaply. The gun registry probably being the most obvious example. It's supposed to cost $100 million. It costs billions. So I'm a little hesitant to say that. I think the BC government does buy all the drugs. Don't they buy all the drugs but then there's a user fee back unless you're covered under pharmacare?
Oh, no.
No?
You certainly don't. If there's a new medication out, you're paying $300 or $1,000 a month for it. The provincial government only kicks in if you're spending 17% or more of your income on prescription drugs. And of course, with the highest housing prices in Canada, you do have a choice between a roof over your head or do you take that medication?
Yeah.
In Saskatchewan, on the other hand,
you touched on a great point here with the idea that there seems to be infinite levels of government or infinite government agencies taxing us, making us pay for things, user fees, stuff like that. And there's only one taxpayer. And you'll hear politicians say, oh, there's only one taxpayer, and yet clearly they don't believe that because, BC Hydro increases their rates on top of ICBC increasing their rates, on top of the MSP increase, on top of drug increases, on top of property tax increases, on top of TransLink increases. And you just layer over and over and over again. In the past, we've called this scenario, we've compared it to being nibbled to death by a duck, where, one bite may not kill you, but, all these different agencies overlapping on top of each other, the wounds add up quickly.
Sure. I mean, most people, if they get a pay raise at all, it's 1 or 2% a year because of the Cook numbers, of course, for inflation, because they don't include fuel and housing. How about that? And so, but what about your food bill? In Canada, it went up 12% because of the difference between the Canadian dollar and the U.S. dollar. Did you get a 12% raise? Your property taxes in Vancouver typically go up 8 or 9% a year. And of course, property in Vancouver's gone up 35% in a year. So add the tax on top of that. Did you get a 50% pay raise like Gordon Campbell gave himself when he was premier?
Yeah, no, of course. And that's the problem is I think a lot of people feel like they're falling further and further behind. And evidence points to the fact that, yeah, they are. Right now, the CTF, we're touring our national debt clock across the country. And, so we're talking a lot and thinking a lot about debt. And conversations we're having with everyday Canadians is it's not just about government debt they're concerned about. They're concerned about their own credit card debt, their own mortgage debt, their own, consumer debt. They look at the government and say, geez, we owe $31,000 in British Columbia per capita in federal and provincial debt. That's on top of the, whatever amount of money they owe in their own consumer debt. These things there's been a real withering of Canadians' buying power, and government is a big part of that.
Now, one thing that I found really interesting is when Harper dropped corporate taxes in Canada, their revenue went up tremendously because something like 300 plus companies from the U.S. moved their headquarters to Canada, including Burger King / Tim Hortons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the evidence does show that when you cut taxes, generally revenue ends up going up. So even the BC Liberal government, remember when they took power in 2001, they came in with very aggressive income tax cuts after the NDP decade. And within a couple of years, they were, generating more in revenue through those income taxes than they were before the cuts. So, it does show, that taxes do affect economic growth, economic prosperity. And I think that's why, we're trying to aggressively remind the Liberals, hey, you guys believe in cutting taxes in order to spark economic growth. Why don't you cut some of these taxes, MSP, for example, and go from there. One of the great myths from the last, 8 years or so is that the Liberals have kept cutting taxes. And, they'll point to a list. I think they, in the last election, they had a list of like 100 taxes they had cut or reduced. The problem is almost all of those cuts now are funded by increases in the carbon tax. And, because the carbon tax is revenue neutral to government, they claim that they've cut other taxes for it. It's true, but at the same time, it doesn't really affect you or I. We end up still paying the same or more because, tax is tax. So these are some of the myths that I'm trying to articulate now and put some numbers to, so that as we head into next May's election, people are gently reminded that the Liberals' tax record isn't as sparkling as they might make it out to be.
Well, carbon taxes, from what I've seen, are useless if you're trying to reduce gasoline consumption, because if you drive to work every day, how do you reduce that? If you have to buy groceries for your family, how do you reduce that grocery trip every week? If high gasoline taxes were the solution to carbon, then Europe should be carbon free, because they pay extraordinary amounts of money for their gasoline. And I haven't seen any difference in consumption because of it. People just swear. And what's more, because they have to pay this carbon tax that I would think should go to transit if you want to get people out of vehicles, but it doesn't. It would have an effect on the consumption rate of fuel, but it doesn't.
Yeah, you're right. The numbers show that, fuel consumption went up in the years following the recession and then following the carbon tax introduction. So, no, you're absolutely correct. The carbon tax is one of those things that, the government does in order to look good in the international stage, but frankly doesn't do much for the average person. And you know what? To her credit, I will say, Premier Clark basically abandoned Campbell's plan to continue raising the carbon tax by, $5 a ton every year. She froze it for 5 years. They're in the middle of a review right now. My suspicion is they'll announce another freeze for another 5. So at least it's not getting worse, which does differentiate her from Gordon Campbell. And I do note that the NDP seem to have come around on the carbon tax and seem more than happy to get rid of some of the tax cuts that went with it and spend that money on their program.
Jordan, you must really feel vindicated. For years, you screamed and yelled about the need for fare gates on SkyTrain. And now that they've put in gates, they found out that there was massive skipping of paying fares, just like you logically would think. Do you feel better that perhaps we know now that they squandered $250 million?
Yeah, $250 million, I think, is a conservative estimate of what they lost between 2000 and 2014 in fare evasion. I feel half vindicated. The fare gates were grossly over budget. TransLink made it as difficult and expensive as possible to install them because they never wanted to do it. The provincial government forced them to do it. I wish that they had gone the second step, which would be to abolish the transit police force to go with it. 2/3 of what transit police used to do is write tickets for fare evasion. Now that you have fare gates, one assumes fare evasion being reduced. The numbers certainly show it has been. So my thing was, look, scrap the $35 million a year transit police force. Take $17 million of that, or half of it, put it into more transit security officers. They're cheaper. They cost about half the price of a transit cop, and they can still ticket people. You'd get actually more eyes on the system. You'd get more value for that. And then take the other $17 million and put it into, new bus routes or, things that, would help people move around the region. Unfortunately, TransLink's bought into this, idea that they need their own police force, the only transit-only police force in, Canada. And so they continue to waste money there. So there's even more savings that could come if TransLink wasn't so, married to the transit cops.
Well, it seems to me most of the violence on the transit system doesn't happen at SkyTrain, where you see all the transit police. It happens on the buses in the poorer parts of town. I've never seen a transit cop on a bus on East Hastings or Nanaimo or any of those routes.
No, bus drivers tell me it's like seeing a unicorn or a Bigfoot is seeing a transit police officer on a bus. Look, if there's an incident on a bus or on a SkyTrain, people don't care what police force shows up. If it's VPD or RCMP or transit police, no one cares. They just want someone to come in and help them. The VPD could easily have a transit unit like other big cities do. that, are responsible for SkyTrains or for bus loops or whatever, that would actually still save money in the long run and get the job done. So lots of options there. It's just that Gregor Robertson, once upon a time, actually said that he agreed with me and that we should look at that idea, but then he wienered out once the transit police union, I guess, got to him.
Well, also another thing, I think the transit police are really the regional police that everybody has rejected for Greater Vancouver.
Yeah, I mean, there are other integrated units between the RCMP, and including some that include VPD and Delta and Abbotsford and other units. The transit police, though, they would make the point, look, crime doesn't know any boundaries. We got to be able to follow them. I would agree, but I think you can do that through an integrated unit, or just good communication between police forces. And
again, too, I've never seen transit cops on a foot patrol within 900 feet of a SkyTrain station, because crime surveys show that the crime rate increases for 900 feet around every SkyTrain station. So why aren't they patrolling within that 900-foot radius?
Great question, and you'd have to ask them. They'd probably say, jurisdictional police have that covered, in which case it makes you wonder why you need the transit police at all.
I know. I asked the chief of the transit police that, and I just got a blank stare. I mean,
the transit police to me are like one of the telltale signs. Like, I won't really believe TransLink is efficient until they scrap the transit police force, because the value for money proposition of the transit police force is not there. It's been a failure. It's cost a bunch of money. Virtually every, or not virtually every, but a majority of high-profile police discipline incidents in the Lower Mainland in recent years have been transit police officers. There's big problems with that whole thing, and until TransLink wises up and scraps it, you can't really consider them efficient.
And of course, now that transit police force has been established, to disband it would cost probably tens of millions of dollars, because you still have to pay their pensions. And these people, too, by the way, most of them are retired police officers who got rehired as transit cops, so they're double and triple dipping into the taxpayer's wallet as well.
Yeah, so the classic story is, a VPD officer will retire at age 52 or 53, get his full pension, and then, that starts on a Friday, and then on Monday he goes to work at the transit police. He'll make $100,000 a year there, and then he also starts building a second pension.
Right, and the pension,
and we wonder why, and they wonder why we consider it a waste of money.
And I was going to say, a police officer's pension, by the way, is their pay grade that they retired at. And as a favor to a lot of cops, I see sergeants bumped up to inspector for the last 9 months of their career.
Yeah.
Which is a huge bump in pay.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to game the system, and, we should probably have a conversation at some point as a society, like, why are we retiring cops and firefighters at age 52 anyways, at 52 or 53? I mean, that doesn't make sense in a day where, people are healthier and living longer than ever before. Is that a relevant age anymore to be forcing people to retire?
Well, I think for firefighters it is, because of all the toxic materials they have to deal with, and they have a much higher than normal cancer rate. But police officers' life expectancy is the same as everybody else. I think the most dangerous jobs to have in Canada are miner and farmer, and perhaps fisherman, way before a police officer. Yeah,
I would bet that you're probably correct.
Not that I don't think that they do a good job and are necessary.
Jim doesn't want any tickets here. They do a great job. Don't give Jim a ticket.
Yeah. The thing is, I know the ones who work on the line and detectives and so on, and without them, society would be horrible. You look at countries where you can't trust the police; they're not pleasant places to live. But on the other hand, on the other hand, I don't think a robot-driven train car needs a transit cop babysitter.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I agree completely. Especially a system that has cameras virtually everywhere, right? Like, if you're going to have a surveillance state, at least use that to bring down the cost of other things.
Well, Britain has the most closed-circuit cameras in the world, and for some reason, people still get murdered there. Because when I talk to some of the experts in the field, people who commit crimes aren't thinking about the cameras that might catch them. They're just, worried about beating up their victim. They're usually high on drugs or have mental problems. But the one good thing cameras do is catch the suspect.
Yeah, but they can also be used for, if you're watching it properly, you can dispatch security and things like that to help calm down some situations. So, I know what you're saying. I'm a believer in eyes on the street, which is why I'm not saying if you scrap transit police, just pocket the $35 million in savings. I do think you'd want to reinvest it in cheaper transit security.
And getting back to our original issue about, homeless people or people who say they're homeless and Granville Mall, some people have suggested perhaps a guaranteed annual income would be a good idea. In Switzerland, that idea was floated, pay everybody $33,000 a year, and they soundly voted it down in a referendum. I think the idea being the hardworking Swiss don't want people to get money for free.
Yeah, the Swiss also had, there's a little bit of an undercurrent on immigration there too, where they didn't want to make Switzerland even more attractive to migrants and refugees. So that is something to bear in mind, right? Like if you start doing stuff like this, more people will show up. That's a problem. Like I think if you eliminated, in a vacuum, if you said, okay, we're going to do a guaranteed minimum income, and you actually aggressively eliminated all of the various social programs that exist, you might be able to make a case for it. The problem is we all know what government will do. They'll wean her out of, getting rid of, social housing money or rent subsidies or all the other things that people are eligible for as soon as the first complaint comes in. So most people think that a minimum income would just be on top of all these other things, and that would be too costly, and they're probably right.
Jordan, anything else you want to toss in that now that we're chatting?
Well, one last thing we should talk about, maybe it's been a year now since the transit plebiscite, since the TransLink vote went down, the tax was defeated. I've thoroughly enjoyed watching the gridlock between Peter Fassbender and the mayors. I figure the longer they fight, the less we'll get taxed. That's a good thing. I'm very concerned about the politicians' desire to rush into road pricing, though. If people think that road pricing is going to make their life cheaper or better, they're really sorely mistaken. In order to pay for all the bridges, to pay for all the transit improvements that they want, you're talking about a road toll of probably 7 cents a kilometer. And that means, going to downtown Vancouver from Langley, from the urban side of Langley where I live, you're talking about probably $8. Hey, that's a big chunk of money, to spend on top of, 50 cent a liter gas taxes. So this road pricing is not the kind of magical solution the politicians make it out to be. And I certainly believe that the public needs to be consulted through an election campaign or a plebiscite before they bring in that new form of taxation. And also, TransLink can barely get Fairgates up and running. I'm not sure how we could trust them to actually get a full-scale road pricing scheme going.
Well, their scheme for paying tolls on the Port Mann Bridge, I can tell you how well that works. I was billed 3 times for one trip. How could I be going in 3 different directions at the same time? They still haven't refunded me the difference.
Yikes. Wow. I better take a closer look at my Trio bills. I'm starting to hear more stories like yours. I got to take a closer look and make sure I'm not getting gouged.
Yeah, because I only recall going that way, and then I took a different route home. But they dinged me 3 times for one trip.
Only government would think you could go 3 ways on the Port Mann Bridge.
And, of course, they're hoping that you don't notice that on your bill. But I've appealed several times to have it rescinded. They say they'll look at it, but I guess they're still looking.
That's the problem, right? There's probably, that big shiny building right next to the Port Mann Bridge on the Coquitlam side, full of bureaucrats who are supposed to be dealing with issues like this. And yet, how many months have you been waiting?
Well, how long before the robots replace them? Apparently, Adidas has shut down all their plants in China, putting 1 million people out of work because robots are going to make those running shoes in Germany now.
Yeah, it's an amazing world we live in now, hey? Like, it's totally different.
Of course, who's going to wear those running shoes if there's nothing but robots working?
Yeah, well, good point.
Jordan, thank you very much for chatting with us.
Anytime, Jim. Thanks for having me.
Is there a website, by the way, that people can go to find out more about the Taxpayers Federation?
Yeah, go to taxpayer.com. You'll see a bunch of stuff we're doing there with the National Debt Clock Tour. And you can always follow me on Twitter @Jordan Bateman.
You know, I remember when the national debt clock in front of the Vancouver Art Gallery stopped going up, went down, and then went past the zero mark and was building up a surplus under Paul Martin as finance minister. What happened?
Well, yeah, what happened indeed. So the federal Liberals actually in the 90s, you're right, cut real program spending, not just a little bit, by 10 or 15%, actually got back into surplus. At the time, the Wall Street Journal had called Canada an honorary member of the third world because of our debt spending. Things were trending in the right direction. Harper took over, and unfortunately, in 2008, when the recession hit, he fully embraced the deficit budget plan. Put $150 billion of debt back on the clock. We resurrected the clock online in 2009, and then the physical one in 2011. And now we have Trudeau II, who's decided that his promise of $40 billion of deficits over 4 years was too light, and he's now going to bring in $100 billion. So the clock is busy making its way across Canada. It's in Fort St. John today. It's going to visit 9 provinces over the next few months, and we're just hoping that politicians start to think about the fact that it's our kids and grandkids who eventually have to pay the taxes to pay for this.
Well, remember when Harper's finance minister said, we're not worried about the bill because the grandkids will pay it?
Yeah, stuff like that is obnoxious and disgusting. And I've got 3 kids. The oldest just turned 13, and more I think about what her future is going to look like. In a region where she can't afford to buy a house. In a world where I'm leaving her massive tax debt, so that her tax dollar won't be able to stretch as far at a time where probably the world's going to need more flexibility. The governments of the future are going to need to be more flexible with what they're doing than ever before. And the problem is, we're pre-spending a bunch of their money and just patting them on the heads and expecting them to pay for it.
Jordan, thanks again for chatting with us.
Thanks for having me.
My guest has been Jordan Bateman, director of the BC branch of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. You're listening to the Goddard Report on TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. Our YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Questions for the show can be sent to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. The Goddard Report is available online and mobile at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. The Goddard Report is a production of How Street Media Incorporated.